This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for Heart Mojo with Melinda Smith. Now, Melinda, you're starting sort of a new series because you're going to be talking about a subject that I think affects all of us, even though no one wants to admit that maybe they're going through trauma. So tell
Right.
us a little bit about that.
Well, I decided with all the things that I've been through in my life that trauma is at the heart of why I've made some choices I've made. And because of that, I thought it was a topic that needed to be discussed. You know, people, when things happen, we're taught, oh, you just push through it, right? That's what we do. Just put your boots on and chug right through it. And sometimes we do it, but we don't realize the effect it has on you long term. And it can come in a lot of forms. It can come in the choices you make. It can come in illnesses that happen to your body because you're internalizing all of this. And because I do my videos, those of you who watch me on Facebook, from Hospice of the Western Reserve in Euclid, one of my favorite spots to be by the water, I decided to start this series off with somebody who works at Hospice of the Western Reserve, Nathan Gradisher. So Nathan, welcome, because you have a lot to say about trauma. You're on a committee
Yes, I
where you
am.
work on that. So tell us a little bit about you first, and then how
Okay,
you got to where you're at, and then we'll start talking about trauma.
sounds great. I am a provider relations manager with Hospice of the Western Reserve. I've been with the agency for 16 years. I've been serving on a number of committees that we work with for different aspects of hospice and palliative care for the patients, families, and caregivers that we work with, that we serve. And one of those committees is our Peaceful and Proud Veterans Committee. And certainly veterans have been exposed to a number of different factors that could result in trauma. Not all veterans, but many. But I also serve on our Trauma Informed Care Committee, which really works to establish ways that our staff can be trauma informed, that we can be a trauma informed organization, so that we can make decisions in supporting our patients, families, caregivers, staff members, volunteers, all of them, in a way that has an eye towards making sure if a person has experienced trauma, that we're supporting them as best we can and not sort of, reawakening the trauma.
That makes sense. So before we start talking about the trauma piece, tell us how you actually got to Hospice of the Western
Oh,
Reserve.
certainly. I worked in a number of different roles outside of healthcare, mostly in public relations and marketing, and a little bit of sales in there as well. And I found myself working in healthcare in a media and community relations role with Kaiser Permanente many, many years ago. And then from there, I switched over to Parma Community General Hospital, where I served in a public relations capacity, and they had a hospice program. And I was really intrigued by their hospice program. There was a gentleman, Reverend by the name of Ted Bell, who was spiritual care for that particular hospice program called Seasons of Life. And he taught me a lot about hospice, taught me a lot about bioethics, taught me a lot about what hospice does to benefit patients, what hospice does to benefit the community, what hospice does to really support not just the patients who are passing away, who have a terminal illness or a serious illness or a chronic illness, but really supporting the unit of care. So the spouses, the parents, the children, the aunts, the uncles, the neighbors, the cousins. And it really resonated with me that it was something that really made a lot of sense. It was an area of healthcare that was underutilized, and I believe still is. And it was an area of healthcare where the healthcare providers got to do what they studied. So um, it wasn't necessarily the sort of volume of medicine that we see so often, where people have to see a certain number of patients in a certain amount of time. If you've ever been to your primary care physician and worried that you weren't going to be seen for a very long time because there was a long lineup of people in the waiting room, this was healthcare where people got the time they needed when they needed it. It was the right care in the right place at the right time. So after working with the folks at Parma Hospital and Seasons of Life, I saw a blind ad in the newspaper that said, if you're interested in public relations, marketing, and hospice, apply here. And I did. And then I found out it was Hospice of the Western Reserve. That was about almost 17 years ago. and I've been here
Still
in
there.
various roles ever since. Yeah.
Great. So from that point, you had a passion. You learned
Hmm.
to have a passion for that area. So
Yes.
what put you on the trauma committee? And then let's talk a little bit
Hmm.
about trauma. You sent me some interesting information, and I
Oh,
would
good.
love for you to share that.
Absolutely. I really felt that trauma, not just from the veterans perspective, because I've chaired our veterans committee for a very long time. I've been on our veterans committee since its inception. I'm not a veteran, but I do have a great passion for care, comfort, and support for those who served our country, in addition to those who've experienced trauma. I thought that it was an appropriate fit being involved with veterans to learn more about trauma. And as I learned more about trauma and trauma informed care, I thought it was important and relevant to the community as a whole. And so I've stuck with the committee and I've stuck with this effort. It's probably been in place for about 10 years and really worked with the agency for a long time to make sure that when a person experiences trauma, that we're addressing their care in an informed manner so as not to re-aggravate or raise concerns and to meet people where they are. And that's kind of a hallmark of great hospice care, is to meet people where they are.
So one of the things you sent to me was talking about that half of the people will experience trauma or have family members
Hmm.
in traumatic situations. So talk a little bit about that and, you know,
Sure.
what kind of trauma you see.
Well, trauma is interesting. I'll start, not to be too bookish, but the
Be bookish.
definition. Okay, a definition of trauma from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration involves individual trauma, which results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual functioning and mental, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being of the individual. So I think it's important to have a little groundwork as to what is trauma, and
Hmm.
it's incredibly broad. So a lot of people, especially in the work that I do, they immediately go to, you mentioned, well, I've mentioned veterans, I should say, and they immediately go to, well, veterans have experienced trauma. People who served in war have experienced trauma,
Hmm.
but it can be any sort of loss, it can be a traumatic loss. So it could be the loss of a job, it could be a car accident, it could be the loss of a loved one, loss of a spouse, loss of a pet, loss of an item that's important to you. So it could be, the loss of a family heirloom that meant a lot to you and takes you back, and that could be traumatic to some people. And we have to be cognizant of that when providing care, comfort, and support to them.
So how do you handle, what do you see? Like, what are the different things that come to you? Somebody's experienced some form of trauma. You might not know what that is because maybe they're not going to talk about it. So what type
Mhm.
of behaviors do you notice?
That's really a great question. Sometimes it's withdrawal. It's just people are very quiet. I think a lot of times some of the symptoms of trauma include, in addition to the withdrawal, hypervigilance. This is a big one with veterans. So a person is really spending a lot of time. If you'll see them, sort of almost hyperactive in some ways, where they're looking, their eyes are darting or their heads darting, and they want to sit. Veterans, especially if you go to a restaurant with some veterans, they'll always want to sit with their back to the wall, preferably in a corner where they can see all the entrances and all the windows and keep an eye on everything. So those are two areas of sort of symptomology, if you will, of people who've experienced trauma. So I think the quietness and withdrawal, the resistance to care. So the person may not want care from a stranger, may not want care from a family member if they've experienced sexual trauma, as an example. So it's very interesting to be really on your toes as a caregiver, as a family member, as a loved one, to see how a person's reacting differently to what we would consider to be sort of a typical event and activity in life. So if you wanted to, help an older person with bathing, it's very common among older people who have experienced the Holocaust.
No
Um,
showers.
well, definitely no showers, and even just the idea of being, what's the word I'm looking for? Being vulnerable and in their clothing. is definitely something that people who've experienced trauma like the Holocaust would experience. So just getting a stranger coming in to undress you or to help you undress or to be
Right.
undressed in front of, that is not uncommon for a person that's experienced trauma to be very hesitant, very scared, very afraid, very reticent to receive care from that person.
So how do you suggest somebody find those things out? I mean, they're not going to readily tell you, and honestly,
Right?
they may not even realize it. Especially sexual abuse could have happened
Mhm.
as a young child. Now it's
Absolutely.
ingrained in them, and they may not
Right.
even realize it. How do you get to the core of that?
It's important. There's actually a few sort of core elements of trauma, or of trauma-informed care that I want to pull up and share with you here, because we want to stay away from the triggers, but we want to stay close to the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. And I want to see if I can get those up here. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So you want to realize the widespread impact of trauma and potential paths for recovery. You want to recognize the signs of trauma, and we talked a little bit about those. We want to respond by applying principles of trauma-informed care, and we want to resist re-traumatization. So we don't want to re-traumatize the person who's experienced the trauma. And some of those principles of trauma-informed care are really looking at trauma as an organization. We want to optimize our culture to empathize, respect, and appropriately respond to the effects of trauma at all levels. And we want to take a universal precautions approach, which is to say, we've talked about the statistic that, upwards of half of people have experienced trauma or family members have. So we really want to go into this expecting the presence of trauma in the lives of individuals being served, and we want to make sure we don't replicate it.
So once somebody's there for care,
Mm-hmm.
let's say you get, like, I'm a cancer survivor.
Mm.
Okay. Thankfully, knock on wood, nothing's been back with that. But what happens with some of your patients or individuals who get sick again, or maybe again? Is that creating a type of trauma, a different type of trauma that you have to deal with?
Absolutely. And it's very difficult because aging is a trauma. It can cause trauma. Just typical garden variety, healthy aging can be traumatic for
Right,
some people. And so having a diagnosis, overcoming, beating the disease, and then having to fight it again can also be traumatizing.
right.
So it's really an important factor of meeting patients where they are, learning about what their fears are, their concerns are, what may trigger trauma, and intervening in ways that don't cause the trauma to sort of rear its ugly head again.
So that's for the person who's ill. What
Mhm.
about the family?
Well, we treat the unit of care in Hospice of the Western Reserve, and I think a lot of hospices do that as well. So we really approach the caregivers, the family members, the loved ones in a similar manner so that we can talk with them and find out if there's anything that's concerning to them or fears that they have, or see if they're resistant to care for dad or care for mom or care for spouse. And find out the triggers and reasons for those fears and concerns and hesitations. So we really have to dig in and learn about the patient and learn about the family, learn about the caregivers, and find out um, if there was ever a trauma. And really look at different key principles of trauma-informed care, like safety, making sure that the environment is safe and that the patient and the family feel safe. Make sure that we have trustworthiness and transparency so that we're open and transparent in communications. We really try to build rapport with the patient and family. We look at peer support. So it isn't just, we can be there to support the patient and family, but we can't be there 24/7. So we have to figure out ways that we can support them or find out others that can support them from their family and peers. Collaboration and mutuality. Again, I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but we work collaboratively with the other providers of healthcare, be it the family physician, the specialist, things like that. Environment of voice and choice, and cultural and historical and gender issues, so that we're really giving people a voice that they may feel voiceless. They may feel that they're downtrodden, they're beaten down, the disease is back, or I heard a sound or I smelled a smell that reminded me of the trauma of war or the trauma that I experienced, when I was assaulted or in a car accident. I know personally, from personal experience, I was in a very bad car accident many years ago. It took me probably a year and a half before I could ride in a pickup truck or a Jeep or an SUV again, because that's what I was riding in when we got run off the road and flipped our car. So I
Right.
know, what we don't want to do is re-traumatize and say, go get back in the Jeep. So, it's very difficult to know right away, but we develop rapport, we develop conversation, we develop connection with the patient and family in a way that hopefully opens them up and we open ourselves up and we're able to work collectively to make the person have a higher quality of life.
Do you also work with like home caregivers? Because oftentimes the family needs some additional help and you can't be there 24/7.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, we
And
do. We work with home health agencies, medical and non-medical, to make sure that if the person does need additional support that the family's paying additional money for, that we're training them in on trauma-informed care. We're making sure that they aren't traumatized, of course, and making sure that they're meeting our patients where we all are because they're part of the team. So absolutely, Karen. Yes.
So patients can be in a community,
Hmm.
a facility of some kind,
Yep.
but they can also be at home.
Absolutely.
So when you go into the home, do you notice certain things that might make you think this person has been traumatized in some way? For example, there are hoarder situations where people,
Great
that's part of
example.
why they choose to keep everything, right?
That's a great
So
example. Yes.
do you find that frequently when you go into the home? And then how do you, because you can't treat them usually in that environment. So what do you do there?
It's all very case by case. So there's no universal answer to if a person's in a hoarding situation and the hoarding is caused by trauma. What we can do is start to address the trauma and see if we can't peel back a little bit of the hoarding and start to sort of, for lack of a better way to describe it, clear space, both literally
Mhm.
and figuratively, to work with that patient. But yeah, in situations where it's a safety hazard, it's a real challenge.
Because taking them
Excuse me.
out of the home is traumatic because
Yes,
this is their safety nest, so
yes,
to speak.
yes,
So that by itself is traumatic, but you
absolutely.
still need safety for your caregivers and for them themselves. So
Hmm.
you
Yeah,
can't make them go.
no, no, but we can try again. I've probably used the phrase "meet people where they are" a lot, but it's because it's a big part of how we do what we do. And it's really a matter of trying to get into the home, support the patient as best we can, fulfill our mission. We're community-based and nonprofit, so there are some hospices that may be for-profit that may look at it differently. But we look at this as saying this is a person in need. How can we work with the family? How can we work with the patient? How can we work with their other healthcare providers to address these concerns and meet them where they are and get them the care they need? So that if they do have to leave and go to a out of the home setting and into a facility setting, we're doing it in a way that works as optimally as possible for that person. And maybe it's a matter of getting them into the assisted living, nursing facility, skilled nursing facility, and then getting the home reorganized in a way that makes sense and getting them back home again. So it's a temporary situation of moving them out and then with the goal of moving them back in. But again, it's all very case by case.
Right. You also mentioned a little bit gender wise. And so
Hmm.
today we have a lot of gender issues brought up in everywhere, right?
Sure.
And so one of the things I do know is the LGBTQ communities medically have a whole lot of issues because they may have lived their whole life as the opposite gender.
Hmm.
And now you're in a situation, there was trauma related to that. How do you care for people? I mean, you mentioned meeting them where they are. I get that,
Hmm.
but it is a very special situation. So is there additional training that you have for that?
There is definitely additional training for the LGBTQIA plus population. And it is, historically, there is a lot of information we've learned. There's an increased um, likelihood of sexual trauma. There's family of origin may have rejected them. There is an frequency of peer and intimate partner violence. Um, and there's also an increased suicide risk according to the Trevor Project. So it's a real challenge, and all of those things are things that we train our staff to be cognizant of, to be aware of, and be supportive of the person who may identify as a member of that community. And that isn't just for patients, but that's also for caregivers and members of the extended family, or the family, family of origin and family of choice. So we definitely go out of our way to make sure that the unique needs of all communities are met, including those of the LGBTQIA population.
So within your organization, which is Hospice of the Western Reserve,
Mhm.
you also have your own locations for care.
Yes, yes, we have 4 hospice houses. We use those mainly for pain management and symptom control, or for respite, and that's going back to that example of a person who may be hoarding. We can put a person who's receiving home care um, into a respite situation for a few days, and then get them back home, and that may be enough time to um, sort of balance out the hoarding, which may be possible as well. But our hospice houses, we have one at East 185th Street in Euclid, right next to Euclid Hospital, which is our David
It's my
Simpson
favorite
Hospice House.
spot.
Yes, you'd mentioned that. I've forgotten. I apologize. But yes, David Simpson Hospice House. We have our Ames Family Hospice House in Westlake, which is just north of the Crocker Park exit, right off the Crocker Park exit to the north of I-90. Just north of the shopping center there, Crocker Park. People may be familiar with that. We have our Medina Hospice House, which is on Route 18, just past, or just off of Route 18 on the, I'm gonna make sure I get my north, south, east, west, on the west side of Medina. And then we have one in Sandusky as well, which is our part of our Stein Hospice family.
I
So
didn't
yeah,
realize you had so many. I only really knew of 2.
yes,
So
we
that's
have
good information to get out there.
from Sandusky to the east side of Cleveland, down south into Medina, and the west side of Cleveland suburbs as well. Yes, ma'am.
So what kind of protections do you put in? Because you never know what the trauma situation is for your caregivers
Hmm.
or for the individual themselves. Do you add some sort of, I don't know exactly what I'm thinking of, but I know that, let's say they were in an abuse situation. The abuser might still be there. What kind of protection things do you put into place?
Well, we definitely work closely with the patients to find out if we recognize signs of trauma, if we look through and we see some of the common symptoms of trauma. What we try to do is work with them to find out what the reasoning behind it is. And so we want to prevent re-traumatization, but we also want to make sure that we're um, protecting the patient as well as the family member. So it may be the fact of the matter is that, the mother is in our hospice care, but we recognize that there's some trauma being that
What,
there may be some traumatic symptomology in one of the caregivers, and they may be in a relationship that is physically abusive or emotionally abusive. So can we work with that family member and ask what's happening, because it does impact the patient care.
Mhm.
We can work to make sure that the family unit is best supporting the patient in our care. And so we can try to reach out to that person and say, is everything okay? And find out, is there anything we can do to support them, because that does impact our patient.
Let's say they're not realizing that they're doing it,
Ah,
right? Because sometimes that's how you were brought up and that's how you brought up, and the next one's in every generation
sure.
experience that form of trauma or abuse, and they keep
Hmm.
perpetuating it.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
there a way for you, the person who is ill at that moment that
Hmm.
you are caring for, is there a way you can help that family member realize, or maybe help get them to some help for themselves?
We definitely, well, let me tell you a little bit about the hospice team, because I haven't really gotten into detail as to what, we've talked about hospice in general, but the hospice team involves nursing, social work, nursing assistants, spiritual care, physicians, nurse practitioners can support the physicians as well. Art therapy, massage therapy, music therapy, different volunteers that do those things, and some staff members that do them as well. And so between the spiritual care and the social work component, there may be an opportunity for some intervention collaboration with the families to address some of those issues. So I think that it's possible. I'm very lucky, and I've been blessed, I guess you would say, that in almost 17 years of doing this with Hospice of the Western Reserve and another 3 years with Seasons of Life in Parma Hospital, that I've not had a situation like this brought to my attention to know exactly the intervention the clinical team would make. But I can say that we would do what's best for the patient and the family and the caregivers and intervene as best we can to support them.
So one other issue that comes up, especially with a senior, it doesn't always have to be a senior person who's ill, but it's dementia.
Yeah.
And not realizing everything that's going on, which has its own sense of trauma, or maybe understanding that they started dementia, which in and of itself is traumatic to know until you get to a certain point. How do you work with dementia patients who may then suddenly have cancer or some other illness that would require your assistance?
Well, actually, we work with dementia patients who have late stage dementia in hospice without other intervening diseases. So hospice can be given to a person with dementia. But if they're experiencing trauma as in regards to yet another diagnosis on top of the already burdensome dementia, then I think it would be very not uncommon for our teams to reach out and really utilize that social worker, that spiritual care person, to intervene and discuss with the patient and the nurse and the nursing assistant, and even the physicians, to talk with the patient and say, we understand there's some things you've been through in life and you want to talk about those. The challenge with dementia and trauma, in my personal opinion, is the fact that people can re-experience trauma over and over again as part of their loss of memory. So, there's already loss of memories as one of the common symptoms of trauma, but then to actually you sort of relive challenging situations because your mind has put you in a different era than we're physically in now. That's a challenge for our caregivers. That's a challenge for the family. That's a challenge for the professional caregivers that we work with, to really address those concerns when it comes to trauma and dementia.
And you might not even know where they came from. Now,
Right.
I had an extended family member who had dementia, who was in a facility, in a community, and she became paranoid, real paranoid. Like no one could come into the room without her freaking out. They
Wow.
never really knew why that happened, but I can only assume that somewhere in her past, something triggered that
Absolutely.
fear.
That's a very logical perspective, and that's an approach that makes sense, and I think a lot of people should take or would have to take in trying to support a person who's going through that. That's difficult.
I think that you do provide programs then that would help maybe the family member who's like, I don't understand why she's like that. I don't understand why
Absolutely.
she's doing that. I mean, my grandmother had Alzheimer's, and it's interesting. When it was going on, it was traumatic to us, very traumatic. So much so, now my mother has got a diagnosis of dementia, and it's totally freaked her out because she took care of her mother.
Oh my.
But we were all very traumatized by what happened. But you know what we've done? Now they're funny stories. We've taken those traumatic
That's
situations where
good.
she might be yelling, or just some of she did some crazy stuff, let me tell you. Now we can laugh about it.
Good.
So have you looked at humor as a way to help people through situations that you're experiencing?
We've used humor. We have a whole presentation called Laugh for the Health of It, where we use humor to address certain aspects of illness and laughter being great medicine, if not the best medicine. So we definitely look at humor as an option there. But one of the facets of the presentation is the appropriate use of humor. And it's very, very important, especially when dealing with trauma, that we not reinvigorate the trauma or reinstate the trauma by, when we think we're making light, having fun, that there may be a trigger hidden somewhere in that humor. So we definitely can use it. We definitely try to use it, but we definitely have to be careful about it.
Well, that's one of the things I started doing with videos when I got involved with Karen. Going through
Yes.
my cancer journey, I
Mm,
talked about everything that happened and tried to make it humorous so that it was
good.
okay to laugh at some of these things,
Oh,
even
that's
if it was
wonderful.
traumatic to go through at the time.
Yeah,
Then started a program called Don't Forget to Laugh, which raised money for the Alzheimer's Association.
that's
So
awesome.
you're right. I mean, it's appropriate humor, but I think if you can look back and make some of the things that happened to you more endearing
Mm-hmm.
and less traumatic,
Mm-hmm.
it'll be it'll be an easier way to survive what you're going through.
Absolutely. My grandfather had Alzheimer's and he was a trumpet player in the big band days. And when I knew him, he was a machinist at Cleveland Pneumatic. But he had when he had Alzheimer's or dementia, he would tell me stories about his big band days, thinking I was one of the guys in the band because I was about the age of the guys in the band. And so I learned all sorts of interesting things about the big band era, about my grandfather, about what his life was like before he met my grandmother, who he happened to have met because she was a server in the ballroom where the band played.
Mhm.
So I learned all sorts of interesting things about grandma and grandpa that I wouldn't have learned otherwise because of his dementia. So I can relate to there being a small silver lining and there being some sunshine and humor and the ability to laugh after the fact.
Well, I think to remind the families of
Hmm.
that,
Yeah.
because let's face it, when you get that diagnosis, it's traumatic, right? You
Oh
know
yeah.
it's not going to be good. It doesn't get better, it only gets worse. But
It's
if you can
heartbreaking.
put a silver, like you said, a little silver lining, get to know that person, talk to that
Hmm.
person. If they are dealing with the trauma, let them talk. Let
Absolutely.
them tell you about it. Because
Yes,
if you got some great stories, I'm sure you would have never gotten
absolutely.
in a different situation, right? A different
There's
scenario.
no there's no question about that. And it's interesting, you talked about letting people talk. One of the things we do with our Peaceful and Proud Veterans program is match veteran patients with veteran volunteers because we find that veterans are more interested, I shouldn't say interested, that's the wrong word, more willing to talk about their service with someone who served. So even if it wasn't a Marine talking to Marine or a Vietnam vet talking to a Vietnam vet, actually the vets love talking to the younger folks, the younger veterans, or the active duty folks as well. But it really helps them to open up and talk. And once the conversation starts flowing, it's not uncommon for them to then start sharing with their family members and loved ones similar stories about their service. So it can be that idea of, conversation and dialogue are really key components of breaking through those walls of trauma and helping people deal
Heal.
with their trauma and heal.
Mhm.
Yes, that's a perfect word.
And I think the goal should always be to try to come to a resolution if you can. I mean, some things are just so horrific. You may never, I guess it isn't, you're never going to forget it. But if
Mm-hmm.
you come to some form of agreement's not the word I'm looking for, but a type of resolution, if you can
Conclusion.
come to a, a point where acceptance
Yeah.
of the situation, whether it's with your loved one or whether it's with yourself. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
think at some point, particularly dealing with hospice, you have to get to a point of resolution where it's like, well,
Yeah.
this is where I'm at. The trauma that I've gone through to get here sucks, but I
Mm-hmm.
have this much of my time left
Right.
and I need to use it.
And make the most of what we have. That's a big part of the
Right.
work we do as well, is to get the most out of the time we have. It may be limited, but there's still plenty that can be done. So much in the realm of legacy work, which is, taking your life history and recording it. So it isn't, doing an ethical will versus a last will and testament. And those are all ways to help to deal with trauma so that if a person is having flashbacks or nightmares or they're just irritable because of trauma that they're, in their
Mhm.
mind, they're thinking about or experiencing, conversation with the family member, with the counselor, with the social worker from hospice, with the spiritual care person, with the volunteer, are all ways to get that information out, let it go, let it flow a little bit, and be able to share with the patient family and importantly the healthcare team to make sure that the patient's being met where they need to be met.
Explain ethical will.
Ethical will is the opportunity to take, I'll tell you what it is first by telling you what it isn't. It's
Okay.
not a last will and testament. It's not saying this is who gets the house, this is who gets the jewelry, this is who gets the stuff. This is taking what makes me me, what makes me important to the world, what I want to leave behind as an imprint, not just of a house and a car or a boat or something ridiculous, but it's what makes me me. So, it's what history I want to leave behind, how I want to make the world a different place than I found it. And it's taking all the things that were important to you and putting them down somehow, not just sharing them verbally, which is great. It's definitely one way to do it, but to put it down in writing, maybe a poem or a song or a painting, or, it doesn't have to be art. It can just be, a written list of things that are important to you, but it's taking what is your ethics, what makes you you, and putting it down so that future generations can enjoy it and remember you.
Well, and so people know you and your intentions versus what they
Absolutely.
see going back to trauma. I mean, if you were traumatized for some way, your behavior may
Yeah,
not be who you really are.
absolutely.
And no one knows that.
Right.
Or very few people would know that maybe. So this is a great way to share it. I
Yeah.
love that idea. So do you put a program together for people in
We
that
have we
situation?
have programs on ethical wills that we do for the community. Absolutely. We have a little booklet called Sharing the Story of You that sort of serves as a way to kind of prime the pump and get the conversation started. So it isn't just, these 3 or 4 pages and that's my whole life in one little handy dandy card, but it's a great way to get the conversation started. And it's something that, especially for persons with a diagnosis of dementia, but it may be very early stage, it's a great way to capture a lot of information from them early so that when there comes a point in time where they may not recall certain things, you might be able to jog their memory a little bit, but it's more importantly, you have it for yourself. So that if, my grandfather would have told me about the big band days earlier, when I was sitting with him, instead of just listening, I could have said, "Oh, that reminds me of the story you told me of Jimmy." And such and such and such and such. So it's important to capture that information as early as possible and as much as possible.
Well, I think particularly in today's world where we're so scattered.
Yeah.
My grandparents used to tell us the
Yeah.
stories of the family. We'd go to the cemetery, they'd tell you the story about each grave and
Hmm.
hear them over and over and over. I can tell you stories of my grandfather because I listened to them all my life, right, until he
Wow.
passed, though we did record him telling some of those
That's
stories.
excellent. that's
But
that's
in
vital.
this type of world where we're all over, a lot of
Hmm.
children don't live in the same city with their parents. They don't
True.
have the opportunity to hear the
Hmm.
stories. I think that's a great way to leave some of those things
Yeah. Well, and
for
so many
yeah, go
and
ahead.
so many children's stories now. The story, I have a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old, and all of their peers and all their communication with their peers is all through these very brief text messages,
Text
the
message.
occasional photograph. And so you're losing so much nuance, so much detail, so much storytelling, even among peers, where it's just a quick Y for yes, N for no, or an
An
emoji.
emoji.
Yeah. And
But
that's
we
we're
do
not.
have the technology though today.
Hmm.
Look at Zoom. Okay.
Yeah.
Our kids walk around with their phones and they do have recorders on them.
Hmm.
Um, I know that we did some recording of my parents many years ago
Well,
before
that's
either
great.
one of them really were ill. And one of the stories my father talked about was that his father and his uncle both played for a baseball barnstorming team. And it meant nothing to my husband and I when we heard the story. And my youngest son is a sports nut, especially baseball. And when he listened to it, he did the research. He went to Cooperstown and he found their names in the archive.
Okay.
Wow.
So it's things like this that we can get our kids. They've
Yeah.
got the technology, journal it. Okay.
Yeah.
Leave a recording because, we don't know enough about our kids. We don't know what
Right.
our kids
Mm.
want, let
Yeah.
alone if they know what we want.
Well,
Hmm.
it's interesting because kids don't seem to want anything you have anymore, right? My grandparents saved this, pass it on, you could reuse it. This was your great grandmother's. It meant something to me. A
Hmm.
lot of people today, it doesn't. A lot of young people don't want your stuff.
Right.
But I would hope they'd want to know. For me, it was always important to let them know where they came from,
Hmm.
their history.
Yeah.
It might be an item, but it might be more the story.
Hmm.
of how I got to this point, or this is how I came to be. I mean,
Yeah,
we used to have people go to Ellis Island to find their family. Now, so many people are already here, and you can look everything up online now
sure. You just
for
have
the
to,
most part.
you just join, I forget the name of the website, but yeah, all that history is available at your fingertips.
Ancestry.com.
Ancestry. There it is.
This is not a plug necessarily for
No,
Ancestry.
understood.
But yeah, one
Understood.
of those type of things, or the genetic testing things, which
Yeah.
also gives you a
23andMe.
ton of information.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I
Absolutely.
think that if we look at maybe the situation within a family, maybe you don't have the relationship that you thought you should have with your parents or
Hmm.
whoever your loved one might be.
Yeah,
That by itself is a trauma. So when
I
you
was
get to
just gonna
the
say.
situation of hospice or end of life,
Hmm.
the types of things you just talked about, putting those that ethical will type thing together or leaving stories may release that trauma for the person, because
Hmm.
if you don't see somebody, I don't care who you are, you have regret.
Absolutely.
Things not said, things not done,
Hmm.
right? This might
Absolutely.
be a way to help bridge that trauma for the person left behind.
Hmm. No, there's no question that legacy work can be very helpful for the family that's going through the trauma of losing a loved one. But it can also help to release or relieve concerns that the patient that is in hospice facing end of life is really is done. Some of the other symptoms are is that sort of dissociation or withdrawal. People that are just kind of in denial of what
Mhm.
transpired, and it all comes bubbling up at the end. And
Right,
so, if you can get some history, and it's not always happy memories, but getting people to open up and share the memories can make room for more happy memories.
right.
So it's definitely a big part of addressing trauma and helping people face the end of life.
Well, and we met each other because I work in the senior care industry and
Right.
I have for a while. And I listen to their stories every day. They're not even my regular family. I mean, they're not my everyday family. They're my extended family now.
Sure.
But I listen to their stories. And sometimes the trauma is they're angry. You mentioned earlier
Hmm.
about just aging, just getting
Yeah.
old. Your body, listen, I'm not happy. There's a lot of things that I can't do that I used to do, and it's aggravating, right? So
Yeah.
imagine being 80 and
Hmm.
having it magnified more. You're just angry
Yeah.
that life has dealt you that deck of cards. And then you've had
Absolutely.
an illness, the trauma of an illness on top of just the aging process. That's tough. That's tough for that person. So I think if we approach it by listening and understanding, putting ourselves in the shoes of that person. Whenever I've worked with somebody coming in to help me for any of the jobs I've had, that's what I would say to them. I would
Hmm.
say, put yourself in their shoes as much as you can. Then you can address what's going on in their life a lot better.
No, absolutely.
If it's you going through that, you have to think, how would you like to be treated?
Absolutely. And there is trauma that people experience just from being exposed to other people's trauma.
Right.
And so,
That's true.
there's that sort of vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, so that, the person who's, um, the example I think of is the person in the military who's helping to prep those who died,
Right.
for transport back home. They weren't necessarily in the field during the combat, but they're seeing the after effects, and that's traumatic.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, they may not talk about it. They may say, well, I wasn't in harm's way. There weren't bullets flying over my head. I don't deserve this sort of care, comfort, and support. But they do, because they served, and they're
Right.
people, and people deserve care, comfort, and support.
Absolutely. And I don't think anybody thinks about that.
Well, and yeah, and the collective trauma we went through with with all of
COVID.
COVID-19, that's another, generational almost. So that's not a term that's used in in the realm of trauma, but an entire
Hmm.
generation went through a collective trauma around dealing with COVID-19. So everything shut down for months, and
Right.
it was an interesting time.
Well, and there's still side effects.
Oh, yeah,
The trauma of going through that. We don't even
absolutely.
know how much really long term what we're going to see down the road with a younger generation.
It's absolutely true.
and how they look at things. We can see that they've approached life a little differently and trying to enjoy their life more and
Mhm.
do less work. Those of us who work 10, 12 hours a day, right? That they want to
Absolutely.
enjoy their life. So they did learn that out of there, and that's going to be a good thing.
I suppose you're right.
So,
Yeah,
but long term, who knows?
right.
Well, our time has flown by talking about this
Yeah.
subject. We covered a lot of areas.
Yes, we
I
did.
hope
So, is there anything that you want to leave the listener to talk about, not only how trauma affects people, but what Hospice of the Western Reserve can do? And then how do they reach out to you?
absolutely. Well, I'll go in reverse order so I don't forget to say,
Okay.
if you want to reach out to Hospice of the Western Reserve, the general number to our call center is 216-383-3700. But if you have questions specific to some of the presentations and conversations that I've shared with you today, if you don't mind, I can share my number,
Sure.
No, go ahead.
216-832-9390. And of course, hospicewr.org is our website. So those are all ways that we can be reached, and would be more than happy to talk with people more detail and get some of the other members of my committee to share information about trauma with you as well.
Let me
Real,
interject real quick, not just for somebody looking for hospice, but if they want to
yeah,
learn, they can
absolutely.
contact you as well. Okay.
Oh,
So,
absolutely. Yes. I'm sorry if I made it,
no, I
sort
just
of.
wanted to let people know that you can give them some teaching, some general information. You offer
Absolutely.
CEUs, things like that.
We have lots of CEUs, including one on trauma-informed care. Laughter is medicine is one that we can do for the community. It's not necessarily a CEU, but there's lots of different subjects and topics that we can do education on. I would say when it comes to care, comfort, and support of people in general, to anticipate that sort of universal precautions approach, to say that if a person, it's better to err on the side of safety, that a person may have experienced trauma and to approach them as such, especially when they're facing the trauma of a serious illness, or a chronic illness or terminal illness. And that Hospice of the Western Reserve is very happy to be a part of the healthcare community with over 45 years of experience in not-for-profit community-based hospice care.
Okay. Any last words for anybody listening? What can they, just anything. Give us your last piece of advice.
We would love to share some education on any time. If there's a subject matter that is of interest to you in the realm of healthcare, we would love to serve as a bridge to connect you with the right resources if we're not the right ones. And we're always looking for people that are interested in volunteering. So if they'd love to do something, doesn't have to be bedside care, comfort, and support of patients with serious illness, but it can be. But if people like to, take their pets out to introduce them to people in nursing facilities, if people like to paint, if they like to create things, if they like to knit, if they like to do clerical work, if they like to garden, anything like that, we would always be willing and glad to take on some support from volunteers, because volunteering is a big part of hospice.
Absolutely. That's the way I wanted to end this. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nate. We really appreciate you being on
I
and
appreciate the
sharing your
opportunity.
information.
Can't thank you enough for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Well,
Thank
thank you
you.
very much.
Take care. Have a great night.
Bye-bye now.